So let me just give you all some context about my classes, and my hope is that this is something that I use for my context, and hopefully there's something that I say today that might inspire you to apply it to different size classes or different style of classes or style of teaching as well. And so I'd love to talk to you more about that too if you have questions on how this could fit into your context. But my classes here at ASU are primarily principles of microeconomics courses. They typically have between 270 to 380 students, depending on the size of the room. And they either meet twice a week for 75 minutes per class, so hour 15 minutes, or 3 times a week for 50 minutes per class. And I still teach in a completely lecture style format, so students are not expected to have any kind of preparation prior to coming in. I don't expect them to read anything or watch any videos, but I do assign homework assignments through MindTap, and I do use MobLab for any in-class activities that we do. Now, John specifically focused on the experiments part, which is what I love about MobLab. But MobLab I actually use day to day in a kind of different way as well, which is using it for surveys, and so I'll talk about that also. But before I dig into the surveys and the quizzes and the games, I wanted to share some problems I had with my lectures prior to using MobLab. And so the thing that I saw was, even my best students, the ones who come to office hours, who talk to me after class and ask questions and can answer questions, I sometimes see them lose focus. And I think, as much as we want to learn something, we do have a short attention span. And if I were to lecture, continuously the entire class, I will lose all my students at some point. It's also easy for a student who's maybe not as caught up as well to just defer reviewing material later. If they kind of lose focus, they don't know where we are. Now they might just say, I'll just figure this out later. And that's really not what we want as professors. We don't want them to start the day before the exam to realize they don't understand something. And so these are things that I've seen in my large or small classes that, there are students who will ask questions and figure it out early and those who don't. It's also not the easiest for my students to ask questions in a large lecture. I mean, it's intimidating to say something that you think others might, say that's such an easy question or something like that. So a lot of students just don't ask questions. And finally, the last problem that I have is, there's more than these, but these are the primary ones I want to focus on, that there's some topics in economics that it just doesn't make sense to just talk about it. And I found myself a lot of times prior to running experiments to say, well, suppose you were in this situation and you had to do this, like what would you do? Students with great imaginations might be able to answer, but a lot of students would just say like, wait, what am I doing again and why? And so I think that also was a problem, that some concepts they weren't learning as well because I was just talking about it. So what is my solution to all of this? Well, MobLab was what I started using in my classes. And so MobLab was basically, there are experiments and games that you can run to introduce topics, but I also use it to do quizzes and surveys. And so that addresses the problem of the in-class participation. So here's how I use MobLab. In a typical lecture, I will give a quiz or a survey. So quizzes are ones that have right or wrong answers. Surveys are ones I just want to get an understanding of the student and what they think. Every 15 to 20 minutes, just to break up class time. It could be something as simple as a 1-minute survey that basically says, what do you think about this? So, we just talked about consumer theory in my class, and I was talking about 2 different products, and I basically asked the class, what do you think about these 2 products? What would you, how would you consume it? And so that was just for them to think a little bit about the topic prior to going in. Or it could be a really long one where I have them work through an example or a few examples after I just did one in class. And so that way they can apply it. I also allow students to work in groups and discuss it, and most of them do. And it's always great, when I give a quiz and then I see students helping each other out, they're pointing to the screen trying to say like, well, no, this is the line, and you can see how they're moving their hands and explaining to each other. So when I see that, students are teaching each other, they're learning from each other, and that's to me, something awesome to see. Now that's the quizzes and surveys part of MobLab, which I'll talk about first. But then I will also talk about experiments. And in a typical semester, I really only run between 3 and 5 experiments. So it's not something that I do every single class, which I think is one of the pushback oftentimes is, professors say, I don't have time to do this, and really it's just, if you can add 1 or 2 in, that's a huge difference already. But I'll talk about the one that I think is the most important, which is the convergence to equilibrium experiment that is run. But I also usually do these games for game theory, tragedy of the commons. Those are ones that I always do. And sometimes I do additional ones on top of that. All right, so let me talk a little bit about the in-class surveys and quizzes and my use cases. I really use these in 3 different ways. They usually have a small number of questions. I don't need them to be like an actual quiz because I really just want to refocus and to be able to talk to classmates. And I so oftentimes see someone say, when I walk around, like, did you understand like that last thing that he talked about? And then someone's like, well, I think he was saying this and that, and they're trying to work it out together. And that's exactly what I want it to be, so they don't get lost at the end of the lecture, but in the middle of the lecture, when they can still ask questions, they can think about these topics. And so the 3 different use cases are, one is giving it as a quiz. So, maybe I just went over an example on tariff, and I asked them now to do the exact same thing, but I changed the tariff value. So maybe now instead of a $2 tariff, I have a $3 tariff on a good. And they would basically do exactly the same thing, but now they have to think through that process themselves. And so that's the quiz case. I also asked a lot of surveys in my class just to get them to think about it. I already mentioned to you the consumer theory survey. I asked them just on their opinion. Sometimes, like, if it's a harder question, I just say, like, okay, there's no penalty for getting this wrong. What do you think? Like, what should the indifference curve look like in this case, right? And I let them, answer the question at a kind of a low stakes way, and that way they can think about it without worrying about getting it wrong. The third use case is, to me, something that has been the most impactful, and that's to get feedback from students. I use this in 2 ways. One is I have students submit questions on MobLab at the end of a major topic, and I basically ask them this, is there anything that was unclear in this topic? And they can say no, and that's fine if they understood it. Most of them do say no, but a lot of them also ask questions. And so, I would say maybe about 20% of the class would have actual questions on the topic. And, those questions sometimes are ones that are just to clarify something, but oftentimes they're also ones where students are trying to think, how do I apply this to this other concept? And so what I do is I look at all the questions I get from all my students, and I make an announcement or an email post that answers these questions. And so, to them, they get to see that their questions can be answered, and maybe sometimes they don't even know they have a question, but when they read that someone else asked that, now they have an answer to that question that they would have had to. Also, I ask them how they studied for an exam so I can give them better feedback. So before an exam, I tend to ask, how did you study? What did you do? And after an exam, I kind of ask them how they felt about it. And that way it just gives me a little bit of a better idea whether they did how they expected or not, because you have all the data for all of this. So let me just say something administrative about the quizzes and surveys before I give you some screenshots of them, and then I'll talk about experiments. I tend to reuse quiz questions semester to semester, and I write new ones when I see fit. It's really easy to do them. I usually do them the night before. So I prepare all the questions I want to ask in class, and then in class I just click run and everything runs. So quizzes are also a way for me to encourage attendance. And so when I make quizzes count for something, and I have these every class, at this point in the semester, in my classes before I use MobLab for quizzes and surveys, I might have maybe 50% of my class showing up at this point. At this point today, I still have about 80 to 90% showing up to my class. And so it's good because students they know that coming to class helps, and they can get points and so on. What I love about MobLab too is I have access to all the data. I don't have just access to the data that is compiled for me. I have all the raw data that if I ever want to go back and look for anything, I can find it really easily. And so I always look at the data for, different things, and that just for my own curiosity. But MobLab also compiles the results right away so that I can show students how they answered if it's a kind of an opinion question, or I can see right away what students are struggling with and address that right away after that quiz is over. And you can also, make these all count for points. You can, sync it to your LMS and all that stuff. So all of that is in MobLab as well, just like it is in MindTap. So, I'm excited to see how it's all going to work together. And also students, more importantly, can go back and see what they got wrong. So it's not like they take something and now you have to pass it back out. Well, they see it right away if you allow them to. So you can maybe hold off on it if you are having some people make up quizzes or something, but whenever you allow them, they can go back and see their answers and what the right answer was, so they can go back and study on that. So let me show you some screenshots of the quizzes. So there could be, numerical questions where you can ask them to enter a number, right? I mean, so these questions obviously are possible. Multiple choice questions with one right answer or with multiple right answers, those are all possible as well. So students will see, this on their screen. And one thing also I should mention about MobLab is device neutral. So it's not like they have to bring, like a specific device. They can use it on their phone, their tablets or computers. So they can really use the Wi-Fi or their cell connection, whatever works for them. And that reduces a lot of problems than just having them bring laptops. Also, so like opinion questions like this, right? What best describes your current stance in international trade? Obviously, there was no right or wrong answer in this one because I was just asking for their opinions, but I was able to show the class, the results of what the class thought about trade before I even talked about it. And then I asked the same question again after I taught trade, and I showed them how people change their minds, right? So you can kind of see how that could be also used to do a before and after kind of survey. And finally, I mentioned something about the feedback. So this is what I do, for, let's say, international trade. It's like a free response question where they can just type a response. Like they could ask a question, they can say, no, I don't have any questions. And that way I can just see all of that without having to collect a bunch of papers and then having to go through all of that. So now it's all on a neat, Excel file that I can just look at and kind of scroll through, when after class. All right, so that's what I want to talk about quizzes and surveys, but I think the more exciting thing, the things that I think makes MobLab so special is their experiments in games. And I want to make sure that, I say this first, which is experiments in games in my class are not just something that I do that's fun. It's not something I do just to spice things up. It's really a critical part of student learning. And the reason for this is because, when I go through the semester, I keep relating back to the results from the games that we play. So the most important game that I play in my class, Principles of Microclass, is the game about the competitive market and how an equilibrium is achieved. And I've brought this game back up numerous times in the semester because so much of economics is about a convergence to equilibrium. So we just finished international trade, and I taught about import quotas and why the price should be expected to increase, but it's once again an equilibrium argument. And so I was able to tell the class, okay, do you remember the MobLab experiment? And all of them do. And I said, okay, well, in that experiment, this is what happened. And so this is exactly the same thing as what's happening here, except it's, in a different context. And that way they're able to see, okay, that's why the price has to increase when there's an import quota on this market. And I think it's a huge part of this class because they always take that with them, and that's the more important thing. So with that said, I do think the pre-game instruction and the post-game discussion then are very important, because if this is something that you'll bring up over and over again, you want to make sure the students know what they're doing, and so they can kind of think through it. And then afterwards, you want to make sure you discuss it. And the nice thing about all of this is, MobLab has great economists that have thought through these things and kind of have mentioned, like, what should you talk about in the introduction? What should you talk about after, to kind of hammer these learning objectives home. And so these are all resources that I believe would also be made available on MindTap with all the MobLab games. And so that's something that's going to be a great resource. Now, let me say a little bit about the competitive market game, just to show you a little bit. I'll show you some results and what I talk about in the results. But I usually play the competitive market game right after I talk about supply and demand. I introduce them separately, and then I say, okay, let's put them together. And here it is, right? Here's the supply and demand diagram. Now, where the supply and demand intersect is what we call an equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. And right at that point, I stop and I say, well, before we say why, let's try it. Let's try a game and see whether this is something that's just theory or if it's something that we actually can see happen. And so the game, one of the ways, is just to show students that this is not just, something on a piece of paper that they have to know for a test. This is something that we can actually expect in a competitive market. And we're going to learn over the semester how the assumptions are broken, right, in the real world markets, but they can see in a pure competitive markets, how does how does an equilibrium form, right? How do we converge to one? So my process for all of this, it usually takes 20 minutes. I take about 7 minutes to explain to students what they're going to be doing. So I kind of show them like the controls, and I show them like, this is what you'll see as a buyer or a seller. And then we play the games, and that takes about 6 minutes or so. And I run through multiple rounds of it so they can have, different experiences. And then I spend the last 7 minutes or so discussing the results and showing them what they got. And so just to kind of give you an idea of what they see, if they're a buyer, they see a screen like this. They can bid on oranges, right? They're trying to buy oranges. In this case, they have a value for oranges. And so there are different controls that they can control. And their goal is to really get as good of a deal as possible as a buyer, right? And so they're trying to buy 3 oranges in this case. And of course, there's also the other side of the market. So basically, I split the class into buyers and sellers, and it's automatically done in MobLab. And I have, in my large lecture classes, I run a few different markets. What I mean by that is each market will have 40 students. 20 of them will be buyers, 20 will be sellers. And so this just gives, the game a little better pace, and it's not all rushed. And also I have more data points to show students at the end of class, like the results. Like there's like 10 different markets in this room. Here are the results from all 10. And we can see in all 10 they converge, right? So that's just more convincing argument for the convergence. And as a seller, they'll see the screen is similar, except instead of bidding, they're actually asking for an orange. Of course, just because they ask for $1.04 doesn't mean they can sell it. A buyer has to, be willing to pay that, right, in order for them to sell it. So anyway, that's what the students see, just to give you an idea, but I want to focus really on the results, right? So at the end of the game, I tell students, okay, so you guys were a part of this market where, here's a demand curve. We just went over that. Now, what you did not know, if you were a student, was that the value of an orange that you got was based on this demand curve. So there are a bunch of points in this demand curve, and each student got 3 points on that demand curve. And so I basically tell them, you guys made up that demand curve. And on the other side, we have sellers, right? So I click on the supply button there, and it shows the supply curve. And I tell them, okay, if you're a seller, then your cost to produce an orange was coming from that supply curve, right? You were 3 points on that supply curve because you had 3 oranges to sell. Now, based on what we've learned in class, what I just said before the game, we said that where supply equals demand is going to be the equilibrium price. And so that is 97 cents in this game. So that should happen at 97 cents. Now, how did we do? How did you guys as a class do? So I show them the transactions. So these are actual transactions from the students. And so here's one group. And you can see this is, I think this is the first time or second round that we're playing, so students are getting the hang of it still. But even in a game like that, they're able to, kind of start converging to that 97-cent price. Now, when I show this to them, they no longer think that this is just something on paper, because they now are curious. How did I bid, around 97 cents? How did I know that? Right? And this is the powerful part about these experiments, is now you can start the discussion. So here's what I usually do with this. I say, all right, if you were a buyer, right, what would you have wanted, right? What is your dream? And of course, the buyers would say, if it'll be great if I got an orange for free, like $0, right? So I asked the class, okay, how many students are willing to buy an orange for $0? Of course, all the buyers raise their hands. They're like, I would have bought an orange for $0. Okay, how many sellers are willing to sell an orange for $0? No one raises their hands, right? And so here's the idea of, well, there's a shortage. The quantity demanded, which is really all the buyers, is greater than the quantity supplied, which is 0. So then what naturally happens? So what did you guys do? Did you just stay at 0 and you just waited for someone to sell it to you at 0? They're like, no, I started bidding higher prices so I can get an orange, right? I didn't just sit there at 0. And now they start seeing this upward pressure that we described. When there's a shortage, there's an upward pressure to push the price up. And I asked the same question for the sellers, like, what would be your dream, right? They would say, I would want to sell oranges for, like $2.50, like that's the highest price. But of course, no one would buy it at that. Well, now there's a surplus. And what happens? There's this downward pressure. And so I refer to this upward and downward pressure.
Hi, folks. I think we are.
I think that's really powerful, in explaining to students that. So one final thought I have is that you know, I wouldn't just say like add a bunch of stuff to your class to make it, you know, like now this experiment and game-based thing. My recommendation is just start small, right? Start with maybe one survey or quiz a class. Maybe start with one experiment in the semester, right? And just see how that changes your class and your students' participation. And, you know, that's what I did. I started really small. I did one experiment. I did one quiz a class, and I kind of slowly added to like multiple quizzes a class, multiple experiments in the semester. And I really do think it's changed the way that my students learn and how I enjoy teaching my classes, because now I see my students interact more.